Chapter 8. The Flute. "I've never had that happen before," Kathy Peterson blurts out at my third flute lesson. She is an excellent teacher with 29 years of experience, but apparently I am her first student to be able to not play a middle C. Being able to not play the middle C is different from not being able to play it. It is all about where you put the knot. Being able to not play it is a bit of a specialty. It means I am very good at not playing the middle C. No matter what I try or how hard I try it, I cannot play it. On the other hand, not being able to play it sort of implies a yet, not being able to play the middle C yet. It is very possible that overthinking the point of distinction between where the knot goes is contributing to the problem. There's also a mathematical aspect to my early difficulties with the flute that I am literally not quite grasping. The geometry of a tripod is generally thought to be a stable figure, its 3 points preventing whatever it is holding from teetering over in one direction or another. But when the tripod consists not of 3 sturdy legs of steel or wood, but rather your lower lip, left thumb, and right pinky, the dependable tripod feels more like a slippery jellyfish. Kathy is a bit concerned and gently suggests, instead of waiting the customary week before our next lesson, that we should have a remedial lesson the very next day. She suggests it in the same way a good doctor might suggest a bronchial inhaler when a patient comes wheezing into the office, snorting like a wild boar in heat. I am told not to do anything, including touching the flute, until our remedial lesson, lest I exacerbate the problem and make it even harder to correct. This knot is very clear and requires no thought, only obedience. The whole idea of remedial lesson sends me back to elementary school, where there was a remedial reading teacher named Hazel. Hazel was short and thin, stooped with a beak of a nose, and brittle gray hair like straw that stuck out sideways from her head and made her look very much like every fourth grader's stereotyped idea of a witch. This, of course, earned her the nickname of Witch Hazel, which would send me and my classmates into paroxysms of laughter whenever we saw a Witch Hazel walking down the hall toward us. The remedial lesson seems to head me in the right direction. Even though it doesn't solve the problem right away, I still can't play the C, but Kathy gives me a workaround so we can move onward. We won't play any exercises with a C. Seems to me a little bit like painting a seascape without a tube of blue paint, but I may have learned something about expectations from the overly ambitious bassoon experience, so I'm letting her dictate the process. I have my own theory of expectations, which has nothing to do with the financial one that tries to predict what short-term interest rates will be based on long-term interest rates. Mine is more pedestrian, but far more useful. It says that when reality matches your expectations, you feel that life is good. When it doesn't match them, you feel out of sorts, disappointed, and disgruntled. It is safe to start with low expectations and then be pleasantly surprised if things turn out better than you thought they would. A job interview that you believe is a long shot but for which you get an offer. Or a tough test in college that looks at best like a C that you actually ace. They're examples of reality exceeding expectations. It is less safe, however, to turn this approach upside down and have high expectations only to have them dashed by the cold facts of reality. I did just that with the bassoon, and am vowing not to repeat it with the flute. The instruments are so radically different that I find myself grinning at the contrast. Imagine being at the zoo and gawking at the hippos. You close your eyes, and when you open them again, you're in front of a canary. Everything is so much more delicate, refined, and elegant. I like hippos too, and I am not suggesting that one is better than the other, and quite the contrary. The prodigious diversity in nature, as well as in the orchestra, is what, in the best of circumstances, produces the great harmony that both are capable of. Even the posture is different for playing the flute. You're more or less reading the music looking over your left shoulder rather than straight on. Because of this, the music is on your left and your instrument is on your right. Straight ahead is the empty corner of the room. Because of this, having good peripheral vision is an asset in learning the flute. With a clarinet, oboe, and bassoon, you can see or at least sense where your hands and fingers are because they are in front of you. When you play, they're in front of you. Not so with the flute. Your fingers are off to the side, mainly out of view. Initially, it is quite awkward, a little like your first day would be if you were a mailman with a rural delivery route, sitting on the passenger side of the car so you can reach the mailboxes with your right hand, but steering the car with your left way over on the other side of the driver's seat. The chromatic progression of notes up or down the scale is also markedly different from the other woodwinds. Although there are exceptions, to go down the scale on the clarinet, oboe, and bassoon, you progressively press down one finger after another on holes, levers, or keys, and to go up the scale, you lift them up. The flute is not quite so intuitive. I find in my practicing that there are longer pauses between note changes than the music says there should be. I struggle to figure out where to put my fingers. Kathy gives me a flashcard drill, and I enlist my wife, Doyen, to drill me. She holds up a card with a note on it, say C sharp. Then in random order, she holds up another note, maybe an A flat. My job is to mentally process what I see on the card and play that note on the flute. It is very slow at the beginning, as the message from the card has to pass through what seems like a bowl of molasses in my brain before I interpret it and can play the note. But practice makes almost perfect, and the pace picks up. Soon the cards are really beginning to fly by, as Doyen unveils and discards one after another like a magician at a kid's birthday party. Being able to quickly recognize the notes has an immediate impact on my playing, and a certain fluidity begins to emerge. Kathy is aware of what happened with the bassoon and is purposefully leading me very slowly on the flute. It is having a calming effect on me. We have not selected an end piece yet, so there is nothing to measure progress against. I can't assess whether or not I am approaching reasonably listenable because I don't know what that piece is. Instead, we work on tone in the low and middle registers and how changing the shape of the embouchure changes octaves. Kathy encourages me to put a mirror on the music stand so I can see my embouchure. The mirror itself is a stark reality check, and it is wise to concentrate on my mouth and blot out the rest of what stares back at me unmercifully. It is effective, though, in much the same way that a ballerina can self-correct a position or pose by watching herself in the mirrored walls in her dance studio. Once Kathy shows me what a good embouchure looks like, I try to imitate it in the mirror. Often I think my embouchure is right, only to produce a thin, unpleasant tone. Check in the mirror, and sure enough, I am either not centered on the mouthpiece hole or my lips are not forming the right shape. Little adjustments make a big difference in the tone, as does the direction of the air. Making a buck-toothed Bugs Bunny face helps prepare for the high notes, and a bit of a thin Mona Lisa smile works better for the low ones. Breathing starts way down in your stomach as you inhale, with an open mouth to sound like Darth Vader. Making all these faces in the mirror is a little freakish. I startled at the recollection of my father when I witnessed him having a stroke. His face went into unrecognizable contortions, a rubber-faced parody of a silly circus clown, changing in an instant to the grotesque leer of Goya's charcoal drawings of men in hell. It was by turns comical and frightening to see my minimally expressive father doing this unconsciously. My brother and I rushed him to the hospital, and by the time we got there he was feeling somewhat better, but with no memory of what had happened. Fortunately, he recovered from that stroke and lived many happy years afterwards. These thoughts nevertheless cycled through my mind as I worked on loosening my upper lip, unsticking it from my teeth with a Bugs Bunny face, and relaxing my neck muscles for smoother airflow. I really didn't think that taking music lessons would involve things like this. Yet Kathy knows what she's doing, and focusing on technique first and foremost for half of our 12 lessons is continuing to pay dividends. I've learned from coaching baseball that you play the way you practice. A casual, not-so-great focus or effort during practice ingrains that standard into your muscle memory, and you end up playing the same way in a game. The results are not good. For high-level performance, you cannot turn the juice on and off like a faucet. You have to practice with purpose. Conscious of this, and even though many of the exercises and etudes are far from heavenly music, I approach them as if they were, and try to play each note, each phrase, with as lovely and pure a tone as I can. It is a challenge because they include difficult fingerings, slurs and tonguing, octave shifts, high scales and low scales. I consciously remind myself that focusing on the process rather than on the goal is sometimes the best approach. I sense that I am slowly yet inexorably moving away from the breathiness of the early lessons and toward how a modern flute should sound. That breathy sound was bred out of the flute as it developed from the primitive, hollowed-out or desiccated bone flutes played by people from the Paleolithic era, some 40,000 years ago. Only drums predate the flute as a purpose-built musical instrument. The earliest flute, 8.5 inches long with 5 holes, came from the bone of a giant griffin vulture and was found by archaeologists in Germany. One entry I saw as I researched the origins of the flute stated in all seriousness that those 5 Paleolithic holes were drilled by hand. Notwithstanding the brilliance of that deduction, the presence of flutes in the daily life of Neanderthals casts them in a substantially different light than the conventional and erroneous image of a stooped and hunched hairy hominid carrying a club. Those Neanderthals had culture. They may even have had a wind ensemble. The vulture flute players would take the high melody line, saber-toothed tiger femurs would provide the middle range harmonies, and a couple of hefty guys with their prized woolly mammoth tusks would rumble out an earth-shaking ground bass. The flute certainly has come a long way, although it took a long time to mature, longer than most of the other instruments. Renaissance flutes were what we call recorders now, and still had a somewhat breathy sound. In some cultures, the breathy quality has endured and become a genre of its own. The ubiquitous folk musicians from Otavalo, Ecuador, with their quenas and cane pipes, seem to pop up in the most unexpected places, enveloping themselves and the listeners alike in a bubble of haunting melodies. I have heard them busking in San Jose, Costa Rica, Edinburgh, Scotland, and Boulder, Colorado. Native American flute music likewise crops up in a variety of places, some far from its roots in the American Southwest. Bookstores, spas, and art galleries seem to be partial to the calming sound and the long, impressionist phrases of the native flute. Where that calming effect is really needed, though, is in the dentist's office, and during the interminable hold times on a helpline when you wait to find out how to work the 4 TV remotes lying mutely on your lap. Wondrously, though, you can find serendipity with the flute music away from the concert hall. Years ago, on a sandbar campsite while rafting down the wide Green River in Utah, it was close to sunset, and the waning, hot summer sun shone its roseate rays of light on the soft red cliff walls. As the water lapped against the shore and the swallows darted through the still air, one of the boatmen, a slim, darkly tanned Japanese Hawaiian man who could have been anywhere from 45 to 65 years old, climbed up barefoot to a rock outcrop. There he sat, cross-legged and bare-chested, and played his native American flute. Without the music, it would have been merely a pretty sunset. But the breathy, hollow, improvised flute was so much a part of the natural setting at that moment that it had a strong emotional impact, evoking a past beyond personal memory that left a strong musical imprint. At our 6th lesson, the halfway mark on our journey to reasonably listenable, Kathy is satisfied with my technical progress and unveils the end piece. It will be the intermezzo from Georges Bizet's Carmen Suite No. 1. She also throws in a Handel minuet. This woman is showing confidence in me, and it's catching. I am also beginning to feel it. I can now say that I am playing the flute, but I'm not sure what that makes me. With the cello, I was an aspiring cellist, and with the oboe, a beginning oboist. But it is not as simple with the flute. Am I a flutist or a flautist? It seems to depend more on geography than meaning. One flutist can be just as good as another flautist. In America, flutist prevails, while the English prefer flautist, even though in a bit of reverse snobbery, the word flutist appeared first in a 1603 edition of the Oxford English Dictionary. Flautist did not appear until around 1880, some 275 years later. It is a bit pretentious to use flautist in America, but it's perfectly okay as long as you know you're being pretentious, which in the right company can be good for a tongue-in-cheek laugh. If, for instance, you happen to be stuck in a pseudo-sophisticated concert intermission conversation with someone who wants desperately to impress anyone within earshot, you might respond to him, it is always a him, and his imperious pronouncements by saying, "Yes, I quite see your point, but it pales in comparison to the inner voice of the superb flautist in the second movement scherzo," to which he will clearly see he is overmatched and quickly ask if anyone would like a second drink. Perhaps James Galway, the legendary Irish flutist, said it best when he quipped, "I am not a flautist. I don't have a flout, and I've never flouted." There is another flute conundrum that, while not being serious enough to keep me awake at night, is nevertheless puzzling. Why is the flute a woodwind? The flute is considered a woodwind instrument, even though it is not made of wood, in the same curious way that a football is considered a ball, even though it is not round and certainly is not made from a foot. A football is thrown and caught like a ball and kicked as part of the game, so it makes sense that it gets its ball name from the way it's used. Renaissance flutes were made of wood, so the name makers can be excused for holding on to an archaic nomenclature, even as the preferred flute material evolved to nickel, silver, and gold. Another reason the flute is a woodwind is because it produces sound more like the way other woodwinds do than the way brass instruments do. All woodwinds have keys and holes, and the sound comes either from the reed that vibrates as the player blows, or in the case of the flute, by splitting the air blown across the lip plate. The sound emerges multidirectionally, from holes all over the instrument, as vibrating air escapes in different combinations of keys, pads, and holes. Brasses, by contrast, are unidirectional. All the sound emerges from the bell at the end of the various configurations of tubing, and the vibration comes not from the instrument, but from the musician's lips. As we move closer to the end, I realize that, except for the inauspicious beginning, the flute has been the most uneventful instrument to learn. It is my golden retriever instrument. Goldens are so calm, responsive, cooperative, and undemanding. If you treat them right, you are very likely to have a wonderful time together. That is what I am finding with the flute. The flute works with you. It wants you to succeed, and it rewards you. If you relax, the sound will be good. I realize that I am playing more musically, producing a better tone than I have on the other instruments, except for the clarinet, which is the one instrument I had played before. I am also understanding phrasing better and playing smoother, which comes in part from a scanning approach to reading the music. If you look only at the note you are about to play, the sound is choppy and disconnected. If you train yourself to look a few notes or a measure ahead, you can play more smoothly and still be accurate. It is the same idea as looking ahead a few steps on a rocky trail in the mountains, instead of looking down at your feet. By doing so, in both cases, you gain a certain momentum that keeps you moving forward and well balanced. Crossing a stream on a log or single plank bridge is the same thing. If you look ahead, your feet will know where to go. But if you look down at your feet, you are likely to teeter or even fall. This affinity for the flute comes as a surprise, because I had absolutely no attraction to the flute ahead of time. I never thought of playing it, never sought out flute recordings from my music collection, and yet I find it a soothing, comforting instrument. I feel relaxed playing it, maybe in part because of the way I have to breathe to get the right tone. To me, it is like a sigh. There's no back pressure as there is in the reed instruments. This feeling is contrary to how most people think of flute players, and how many flute players think of themselves. They are regarded as high-energy, sometimes high-strung, competitive people, especially in contrast to the stereotypically easygoing and agreeable nature of bassoonists, or the equally stereotyped fastidious and precise oboe players. To add to the cartoon-like characters that make up the orchestra, there are the brash and bombastic brass guys, the barely noticeable wallflower violists, the I-get-the-best-part violinists, the mellow cello folk, the solid you-can-count-on-me bassists, and the real cut-ups in the orchestra, the percussionists. Kathy has recorded a piano accompaniment to the Bizet and Handel pieces, and the approach of my last lesson has the feeling of a recital. I'm a tad nervous, but I've been letting the beauty of the music carry me past my technical concerns. I listened to a few recordings of the Bizet intermezzo and know how it is supposed to sound. I carried that thought throughout the day and have the most peaceful dream that night. I am playing the flute and riding on a cloud, swaddled in cloth like a cherub in a Raphael painting. I awake soothed and relaxed and confident. All goes well at the lesson, which is held outdoors in Kathy's backyard. The music, unconstrained by walls, seems to be lifted from the flute and wafted away into the air. My overactive imagination sees a colorful display of Disney-inspired songbirds pausing on branches, heads cocked, listening to me play. When I finish playing, Kathy stands and with a warm smile and her head cocked to one side appreciatively gives me a gentle round of applause. I like the flute well enough to become a little melancholy at the thought of leaving it behind. There is irony in the limited lesson rubric that I set up as part of learning the instrument and writing the book. I decided on it somewhat arbitrarily, calculating how many instruments multiplied by how many weekly lessons equals how many years and months to complete the cycle. I scribbled numbers on a yellow pad and found that 12 lessons to be the most reasonable equation. 11 instruments times 12 weeks equals 132 weeks, divided by 52 weeks in a year equals 2.5 years. But I am finding that 12 lessons puts me just on the cusp of being really about ready to play the instrument fairly well. Just when I am beginning to feel comfortable on one, for me to play it rather than it playing me, I have to move on to the next one. So the last lesson is behind me, but I still have the flute in the house. I am curious to see if I am only a two-trick pony and can just play the Bizet intermezzo solo and the Handel minuet, or if I really learn to play the flute. I'm a lifelong Gilbert and Sullivan fan, and I rummaged through some old boxes to find a music anthology of all the G&S operettas. I haven't looked at it for years, but it is familiar and thick. I take the flute out of the case that I thought I had closed for good, and randomly start sight-reading the vocal line from the scores. It is pure joy. I don't play the tunes perfectly, after all, I am a dilettante, but I play passably well, especially for sight-reading. Page after page, song after song, my fingers find the notes almost automatically, and I can transition from low to mid to high registers and back as the music demands, relaxed and with confidence. Time stands still. And when my embouchure finally gives out, I look up and see that it is past midnight. So time did not stand still at all. I had played for almost 3 hours. It was as close to being in a musical zone as I have been with on any of the instruments. When I finally do put the flute away and close the lid for the last time, it is with the same satisfaction as tucking a child into bed for the night, pulling up the covers, and placing a gentle kiss on their brow to send them off to dreamland.